was, I believe, a private key issue. Mango markets was an economic manipulation, but Wormhole, Nomad, Horizon, those are all classic bridge exploits. So a variety of issues among the top 10 or so, but um, yeah, still something that we should probably care a lot about. Um, yeah, so here's some common exploits. When we talk about common exploits, one thing that I would like to caveat here is that usually it's either by protocol or by chain. So this is kind of an overview of general exploit classes across, regardless of the chain, but you might have some chain specific ones as well. For example, front running attacks might only exist on chains where you're able to front run easily. So for example, if you have an open mempool like Ethereum, that makes it very common to perform these kinds of attacks. On other kinds of chains where you submit transactions directly to the validator, it might be less likely, but it's still possible. So front running is pretty generalizable. On the other hand, for example, if you have something like reentrancy, which is a pretty common attack vector that maybe you guys are familiar with, um, that's the kind of thing that is only specific to Ethereum, and it's a consequence of the unique programming model that Ethereum has, where you have all these different contracts that can all execute code when you call into them. Token contracts could potentially execute malicious code and do a token transfer, or when you send Ethereum, you can have like a fallback, for example. Um, so those would be more chain specific. And yeah, I think this is a list of some common smart contract exploits, but this is kind of like a high level overview. Um, I think next we have a presentation about intro to Solana, but first we'd like to talk about any questions you guys might have.
I was just curious at like your company, do you guys like specifically only like look at code if a company asks or like if someone asks you to, or do you guys like go out and like try and get like those rewards and stuff or like finding exploits in code too?
That's a really good question. I think generally we mostly operate on a contract basis, and the reason for that is it's more reliable. If you have for example, a recurring contract with a client, you know for sure that you're going to get paid a certain amount. Versus if you do bug bounty, sometimes protocols aren't as willing to pay when you find these issues. Sometimes the reward scale can change a lot. In general, it's not a super great experience. But starting out or when we have extra resources, sometimes we'll have people also do some exploratory research and try to find these bugs in areas that we maybe haven't explored as heavily.
And why did you choose to get into blockchain specifically, coming from that more Web 2 background and doing like hacker ones?
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, blockchain seems like a really exciting space. There's a lot of really cool innovation, and I guess one thing that kind of sets it apart from Web 2 is that everything is radically transparent. No matter what, I mean, one common feature of most blockchains is that you have total transparency to see essentially everything that happens on the network, right? So it's not like Web 2 where you might have an opaque API backend that you don't really see the source code for and you can't really interact with easily. Blockchain is really different in that way. And also the impacts for blockchain security are much higher than in Web 2. If you have a missing check, you might lose hundreds of millions of dollars versus in Web 2, it's a bit harder to justify like a direct impact to money, for example.
I know with like traditional finance, there's a lot of like very low level programming and a lot of regulation involved. Do you
Mhm.
think the lack of like regulation and the speed at which we're moving into this blockchain technology has opened up a door for a lot more vulnerabilities?
Yeah, I'm not sure it's lack of regulation, but I think definitely the increased speed of development makes it so that there's probably a higher chance that people will write bugs. I think whether or not regulation can help solve that is kind of another question, but yeah, definitely people are pushing code, I think, a little bit too fast without really thinking through, what they're actually writing and all the implications. And I think that kind of leads to, these massive losses that we see on the news.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I imagine a lot of what you do is in Rust, Solidity.
Mhm.
Um,
Yep.
I know traditional finance is more like COBOL. Have you like
Yeah.
are you thinking that like Rust is like a good language for the future of blockchain, or are there other languages that are starting to gain popularity? And I don't know, what do you see as the future of that? I
Yeah,
don't
I
know
mean,
if
it's
it's a
hard to
good
say
question.
about the future. I think Rust has pretty nice properties. For example, it's memory safe, and there's also like a really mature developer ecosystem. I mean, some other public contenders, like for example, Solidity also has a really mature ecosystem when it comes to like Web3 specifically. So that could also be a pretty strong contender. There's also some, more novel languages that are blockchain specific. For example, Move, which that it advertises safer programming by default, which I think is generally true. The trade-off there is that there's not as mature of a development cycle. So some of the tooling might not work as smoothly as you would expect in other languages. But I mean, there's always trade-offs, and it's kind of hard to tell which one will come out on top.
Thank you. Yeah.
I have a question in terms of the auditing process, if that's necessary
Mhm.
to ask, or
Yeah.
about auditing process. Do you guys use like specific tooling to like just get I guess get ahead of and just get rid of like the very low level vulnerabilities? And
Mhm.
yeah, I'm just wondering what the tooling you guys may use.
Yeah. So I think it's usually chain specific. I mean, for example, tools that you write against Ethereum probably don't work as well against Solana. So there is some startup process, startup cost when it comes to writing these tools. But yeah, usually, as you said, we have a series of tools to find recurring or common or easily detectable vulnerabilities. But most of our process is still pretty manual. I think it's pretty hard to automate, at least for now, the really tricky parts of smart contract security, right? That really requires a human level contextual understanding of what's happening in the contract and where there might be subtle business logic flaws. It's not really the same as, for example, Web 2, where you could argue that memory corruption is a very clear example of something that went wrong, and you could, for example, really easily fuzz for that. Oftentimes in smart contract land, the bugs are not as clear cut, and it requires you to really understand the context of what's going on.
I see. And usually, like the people that are seeking for audits are usually people who the projects are based in like DeFi or NFT marketplace. I
Yeah,
was
yeah.
also wondering if there are any other categories besides that. Just
Mhm.
curious.
Yeah, so we work with, for example, DeFi, NFT marketplaces. Large portion of our clients are L1s, so the protocol, like the blockchains themselves. Also been doing some gaming collaborations, so working with game companies to ensure that the smart contract components they're pushing are well audited and secure.
Thank you.
And one last question from me. I'm just kind of curious what you think within our lifetimes will be like the largest value of blockchain technology. I know that's kind of a hard question, but I'm just kind of
Mhm.
curious on like your perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, within our lifetime is definitely a really hard question to answer.
Yeah.
I mean, um, I think some pretty clear use cases right now is just like increasing transparency in the financial system, like making it easier to send money. And I think that use case is being pretty readily or reasonably well utilized right now already. Um, I mean, I think down the line it will probably all be along this general trend of increasing transparency, making sure that everything is fully auditable. For example, like FTX, if you have everything on chain, then in theory something like FTX could never happen, right? So in general, things like that are pretty exciting.
Awesome. Yeah, I've definitely heard this question a couple times from some Joe Rogan podcasts I was listening to the other
Yeah.
day. And he was discrediting a lot of the value behind crypto, and I don't think he
Mhm.
fully understand the difference between it as a currency and then the technology that actually exists within the blockchain and how it can be
Yeah,
used for so many different things. So I
yeah,
definitely
exactly.
appreciate that. Looks like we have a question in the chat from Sajid. And he is asking, what would be the recommended school skills or tools, in your opinion, for someone to learn about getting into vulnerability testing?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think when it comes to security, just really understanding what's happening at a low level is really useful. So I think spending the time to get familiar with, for example, if you're looking at blockchains, maybe like roster solidity, and really understanding how that virtual machine operates, or what actually happens when you, for example, send a transaction. I think people who tend to be good at finding vulnerabilities also tend to have a really strong understanding of the code and of what the code is doing. And I think that's kind of the first step I would recommend. I wouldn't really recommend trying to memorize these vulnerability patterns and trying to find those, because I think oftentimes that leads you down the wrong path.
That's a perfect segue as well into the workshop that I'm going to be doing on getting started in Solana and Rust development. So I guess open floor for any last questions for Robert. I really appreciate your time here. Let's see if there's anyone else. Doesn't look like it. So again, really appreciate your time, Robert. Feel free to stick along through the workshop and chime in. But other than that, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.